Hi, I'm Jay Allen Sanford from the San Diego Reader. Today we'll be talking about another episode of the early 1950s science fiction TV anthology Tales of Tomorrow. Written for Starlog, FilmFax, and Cult Movies magazine, and the Reader published my in-depth history of this program a while back that included interviews with the show creators that I taped over 30 years ago. Well, this 43rd episode of Tales of Tomorrow, Ice from Space, was broadcast live as it was performed August 8th, 1952 on an ABC soundstage. It's in New York City on East 66th Street. Kind of a special episode in that it includes the very first professional acting gig for none other than young Paul Newman. So this episode concerns a top-secret Air Force rocket, which was a very timely topic in August 1952. Most people would agree that the first spacecraft was the German V-2 rocket that was launched in June 1944 and powered by a liquid propellant rocket engine and reached an altitude, I think it was almost 200 kilometers, 189 kilometers. And at the time, I think the kilometer point for generally designated for the boundary of outer space was 100 miles. So we were already making our way into space. The space race was really about to start. This episode of Tales of Tomorrow aired in August 1952, and almost exactly 5 years later, in October 1957, that's when the USSR would successfully launch Sputnik 1. And that was the first Earth-orbiting satellite in history, something that the United States had announced in 1955 they'd be doing first, which we didn't quite pull off. Now, on the show, an Air Force rocket has vanished, and then it's going to turn up carrying an extraterrestrial ice cube that at first freezes the desert that hosts this Air Force base, and it starts to spread around, it threatens to spread around the entire planet. And it's really thanks to yet another Air Force blunder. Something that we talk about in several other commentaries is that there's a lot of swipes against the airborne branch of the military throughout the series. Tales of Tomorrow almost seems to have a grudge against, well, really all branches of the military, but particularly aviation. But in this episode, at least, the Air Force base commander, he isn't the bad guy. He's the one who actually wants to save the world from the ice from space, and really no thanks from the meddling, thick-headed congressman who we see here on the right. He was already in the middle of an Air Force investigation when this killer ice arrives. The spaceship had been missing before that. It turned up with the ice after having been missing for a while. So after the block of ice is taken out and the spaceship is stored, it kind of starts radiating this cold. Everything around it starts to freeze. Up to 2 miles, I think, away in the desert, it starts to drop down to 20 degrees below zero. And the freeze is still spreading. They try to figure out how to stop it using explosions and chemicals, pretty much anything you can think of to keep it from spreading across the entire planet. I think it goes something like 50 miles or so over the course of the episode. So the major here that we're looking at is an actor named Edmund Ryan. He plays the space program supervisor, Major Dozier. He was a former football coach, and he also taught history back in his native Kentucky. And he often said that he was really a painter more than he was an actor, and he preferred to be at home painting. Got a start in motion pictures in the mid to late 30s. He did some film noir type roles before he started appearing in TV anthologies. Did shows like The Web, Suspense, Craft Theater, Studio One, Goodyear Playhouse. Did several episodes of Philco Television Playhouse. He's in a terrific episode of Boris Karloff's thriller from 1961, Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper. Robert Bloch story. He also did the Great Ghost Tales, which was a 1961 series that few kind of remember. He's also in shows like 77 Sunset Strip, Naked City, Mod Squad. Did several episodes of Perry Mason, as well as comedies like The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet and I Dream of Jeannie. You may remember him as Fred Jenkins on The Andy Griffith Show. He's the guy that pretends to be an FBI agent in Mayberry, and he's there to give Andy and Barney an award for their outstanding policemanship. It's a 1961 episode called Crime-Free Mayberry. And Edmund Ryan is also in a movie called Human Monster. He did 3 episodes of the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV show, and he did the Isabel episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Probably best known from the 1960 Alfred Hitchcock film Topaz. He's also in the 1970 Pearl Harbor movie Tora, 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 where he shared billing with a good friend of his and a fellow Yale School of Drama graduate, James Whitmore. The congressman here, Congressman Burns, we see standing up, that's Raymond Bailey. You'll probably recognize him as Mr. Drysdale. from the Beverly Hillbillies. Yeah, minus you might not have recognized him because he doesn't have the hairpiece on here. He's minus that. But that is Mr. Drysdale. He wore that hairpiece for most of the rest of his career. Guy has one of the longest resumes in Hollywood. It starts with movies in the late 30s and takes him all the way through science fiction movies like The Incredible Shrinking Man, The Space Children, Herbie Rides Again, and The Absent-Minded Professor. Yes, I said that Herbie the Love Bug and The Absent-Minded Professor are science fiction films. I dare you to prove me wrong. Raymond Bailey also appeared on half of the shows on television at one point or another. He was in 2 episodes of Tales of Tomorrow. Also did shows like The Web. He did science fiction theater, M Squad, One Step Beyond. Seen a couple of westerns, The Rifleman, Gunsmoke. He was in Untouchables, 77 Sunset Strip. Did comedies, did Burns and Allen, did Mr. Ed. He was in Lassie. He was in, well, everybody was in Perry Mason. Seems like everybody was on that show sooner or later. You just ask Sven Gulli. He also did 3 episodes of The Twilight Zone and nearly a dozen episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, a show that really gets mentioned a lot in these commentaries. So the story credit here is kind of interesting. It's credited to someone named E.H. Frank, and it bears a little explanation here. It's well, first I'll tell you that Tales of Tomorrow, when it started, it made a deal with a group of science fiction writers, and they called themselves the Science Fiction League of America. And the intent was to adapt stories by these folks, existing stories, into these teleplays. But as the writing staff expanded and improved, and as more people came aboard, they started doing more original stories. So Ice from Space is an original story. It's written specifically for the show. But it's not written by E.H. Frank. The script, although credited to E.H. Frank, would seem to be, well, if you look him up online, it would seem to be his only credit, if there were such a person. However, there is no such person. That's actually just a pseudonym for a much more established writer who, for some reason, is either miscredited on purpose or by accident. And I found this out from talking to producer Mort Abrahams. He actually said that several episodes of Tales of Tomorrow were written by, but not credited to, one of the program's original authors, who was part of that original Science Fiction League of America, author Theodore Sturgeon. So even though Sturgeon was one of the people who basically gathered the original Science Fiction League, as well as providing one of the first stories that was produced for the show, for some reason Theodore Sturgeon disappears, at least in the credits, from the production almost as soon as he arrives. Or so it would seem. But in actuality, Ted Sturgeon apparently reigned behind the scenes well into the second year of the series, and he provided at least 2 other pseudonymously credited scripts, and this being the third one that we know of for sure, thanks to producer Mort Abrahams. There's other similar stories to this. It can be noted that there's, the concept of science fiction story that has the same kind of premise with a scientist, with an interstellar plague, maybe an organism, or some other deadly mechanism that can be only be stopped by self-isolation and sacrifice. Even Tales of Tomorrow did it a few times. There's several episodes that have the same premise. There's one actually literally called Plague from Space. And this one, of course, Ice from Space. There's one called The Red Dust. Actually, those 2 episodes, Plague from Space and Red Dust, aired back-to-back, consecutive weeks in early 1952. The Red Dust stars one-time Tarzan Lex Barker. He's the captain of a spaceship crew, and they realized that the same radioactive dust that destroyed the civilization they had just visited on a planet is actually made of tiny living organisms, and that they're now on the spaceship. And these tiny living organisms they're invasive, they're deadly, and they might soon reach Earth with them, where it could probably kill everybody there as well. So their dilemma is they can treat themselves with injections, allowing themselves to live up to a dozen or more years if they're willing to just sort of like hang out over space, float in their tin can there. And the implications of the Red Dust, it kicks off a philosophical and really kind of Rod Serling-esque debate that you really didn't see too much in early 1950s TV, unless there were scripts by Rod Serling. So that episode is directed by the same fellow who directed this one, Don Medford. We'll talk about him in a minute. And it was based on a play by a science fiction quarterly writer, a cover story actually, by contributor Theodore R. Cogswell. And he's actually known as one of the first people who wrote very adult Star Trek stories when he wrote a 1976 novel called Spock Messiah. And Don Medford also directed that Plague from Space one that I mentioned. That one has a similar sort of examination of command altruism. And that one, there's an alcoholic Air Force commander, and he's faced with the scenario like, what if the Roswell crash had set off a doomsday scenario? So when it turns out that this glittery disco alien that they found in a spaceship, they probably shouldn't have done in experiments on them, but they did, and that infects them with this deadly microscopic organism. And the captain, who's played by Harry Landon, best known from Phantom from Space, he has to decide if they have the duty or even the right to call in a nuclear strike that's going to kill them, going to kill all the surviving soldiers, of which I think there's only a few dozen left from the original 2000. And that episode actually also features a young James Doohan, who of course would later go on to be Scotty on Star Trek. So Tales of Tomorrow almost always had dangers coming from space. The phrase keeps coming up in even the episode titles: a verdict from space, plague from space, ice from space. It's just all kinds of deadly stuff coming out of space. So, well, we got our commercials here. We we have to sell some stuff here. These are the folks that pay for the program. These are the folks that brought you science fiction adult science fiction on television. And I guess we have to take a break from contemplating what may well be the end of the world as we know it, and the possible extinction of the human race, and talk about a little bit of quality carpeting here. So at the time, Maslin Carpets was one of the program sponsors. They were the second company actually to become a program sponsor for Tales of Tomorrow. In those days, that meant they paid for virtually all the bills to make each week's production happen. Maslin was founded, is based in Philadelphia. That's where they first began manufacturing carpets way back in 1866. They're actually still around to this day. If you look them up online, they're colored, and I guess their patterned lines are said to be some of the finest in the industry. So today they're made by the same company as Fabrica, and they have a shared parent company, Dixie Group, I believe they're called. So they sponsored a few other TV shows in the 50s. They did the Gary Moore Show, and I don't mean the rock and roll guitarist, of course. I'm talking about the TV game show host, Gary Moore. In the 60s, Maslin Carpets were one of the sponsors of the Beverly Hillbillies, but of course by then the sponsors didn't wield nearly so much control over content. They were just basically buying ad space by then. Maslin even had a carpet design that they said was based on, inspired by anyways, by television. They called that design Wavelength. And you still sometimes see that in movie theaters. Very popular carpeting for movie theaters. So we're back to the episode here, and as we get back to the show, I really want to point out how much really they get out of just a couple of sparse sets here. You've only got 2 or 3 sets here. You've got only a couple of costumes, which now are just all you need is a couple of winter coats. And of course, the main prop in the thing is this big block of ice, which probably someone just pulled right out of their ice chest at home. And they make that kind of look ominous by lighting it differently as it expands, supposedly. Although the funny thing is, of course, it starts to kind of melt over the 24 minutes it took to film this, and you kind of notice that over the course of the episode. So the congressman here, who's our fight here really is about how the danger can be stopped. It's a lot like the best of later shows like Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents, shows that could take just a couple of sets and a couple of costumes and really give you something, with writing, directing, and acting that kind of rises above the production values and the low budget that they're kind of working under. Never really established in the show, though, whether the ice is some kind of weapon, whether it might be some kind of maybe sentient being like the Blob that wants to eat up the whole planet. But really, the origin of the ice and it's even its intent really doesn't matter, because the story is this conflict between these two fellows here. It's the battle between the two actors, one of whom knows something has to be done to stop it, and the other one is more concerned about the congressman, more concerned about top secrecy. And here's Paul Newman popping in here. We'll talk about him again in a second, too. Really, the performances, this may not be the best episode of Tales of Tomorrow, but the performances are all fine. The sparring between the congressman here and the major is talky, but very well played, and it builds a lot of tension. Certainly there's a lot of sharply delivered dialogue here. The congressman, he gets in a lot of digs about the major's father, and how his father would have handled things differently in a crisis. And the way the the Major kind of winces every time that he gets one of those insults. And the way we kind of see his anger simmer and gradually explode, it's really fairly well played. There's the usual line flubs. There's, it's live televisions going out over there as they were performing it, so they can't even make up their mind at one point what to call the rocket ship. At one point they call it I think the B-76, and then within a few minutes later they're calling it the AR-76. So the story actually was also adapted for a book. It was created specifically for the TV show originally, but then later on there was a series of Tales of Tomorrow books, and Ice from Space was one of the ones adapted for it. They were written by Wingmaster author David Houston, which is apparently the pseudonym of an American writer named Houston Force Lumpkin III, which in my opinion is better than his pen name. Should have stuck with that. He's a Starlog writer, actually became known for writing things like, he did a paperback version of DC Comics Swamp Thing, and episodes like Red Dust and Substance X, they also were adapted for the same book series. Ice from Space, I think, was the fourth Tales of Tomorrow book. They came out around 1981-82. And the funny thing about the Ice from Space one is the cover of that book features the flying sub from Voyage at the Bottom of the Sea. It's kind of standing in for the spaceship here. Not sure why that is. So our director, Don Medford, we're going to talk about him for a minute. He directed about 35 episodes of Tales of Tomorrow, a show that ran about 85 episodes in total. He was a Detroit native who moved to New York City in 1946 to work on live TV shows. And in December 1954, he directed Ronald Reagan and James Dean in a live installment of GE Theater. No, it's like GE True Theater, I think that one was called. It was an episode called The Dark. And, well, his nickname was Midnight Medford, and I found out that was because apparently he was very skilled at doing what's called day for night shots. That's where you get you're shooting your scene in broad daylight, then you underdevelop the film so it looks like darkness. And I guess the shadows are the way to really tell that you had day for night shooting. He ended up directing nearly 100 TV shows, Don Medford. He did 5 episodes of The Twilight Zone. He did 2 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which was a show that actually brought him to Hollywood. Alfred Hitchcock had so much faith in him that he brought him out there to work on the show. Did that. Then he also stayed in California, and for most of the rest of his career, he directed 6 episodes of The Fugitive, including the final episode, which at the time was the most watched TV show in history. I think something like half of all U.S. homes with television sets were watching that one. He also directed nearly 3 dozen episodes of the FBI, did a couple dozen Berettas. In fact, Beretta, he liked the star of that show that much that he worked with Robert Blake again. They did a 1985 TV movie together called Helltown, which was also turned into its own TV series. Don Medford directed 13 episodes of The Detectives. That was a cop series that starred Robert Taylor and Ty Andrews from the Mod Squad. It was on 59 to 62 or so. He directed 26 episodes of Dynasty, as well as working on Mrs. Columbo, Airwolf. Did the final episode of the 1980s primetime soap opera, The Colbys. And he was behind the scenes for 12 O'Clock High, Dr. Kildare, The Rifleman, The Untouchables, The Fall Guy, The Streets of San Francisco, Cannon, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Police Story. Boy, I could just go on and on. Jake and the Fat Man. Don Medford's Twilight Zones are probably the closest to what he did for Tales of Tomorrow. He's the guy who directed A Passage for Trumpet with Jack Klugman. He did the Genie episode, The Man in a Bottle. Did The Mirror with Peter Falk. Did Death's Head Revisited. That was the one in the concentration camp. And he did one of the hour-long episodes. He did Death Ship from the 1963 season. His films include the Sidney Poitier Mr. Tibbs trilogy. He did the third one in that from 1971, The Organization. And he did the 1978 science fiction film, The Clone Master. Don Medford did a bunch of TV movies, too, like the 1971 Leslie Nielsen Richard Kiley movie it's called Incident in San Francisco. Did another one in 71 called The Haunting Party, TV movie that had Oliver Reed and Gene Hackman. In 1973, he directed a blaxploitation TV pilot called The Fuzz Brothers, which, as you can probably guess, is about black police officers. In this case, playing brothers, played by Louis Gossett Jr., and a fellow named Felton Perry, who you probably know. He was in the early Dirty Harry film there. I think Dirty Harry itself. He was, no, he's in Magnum Force. He played Inspector Early Smith in Magnum Force. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the Fuzz Brothers was not a pilot that got picked up as a series. So if you remember the 1976 TV series by Stephen J. Cannell called The City of Angels, starred Wayne Rogers from MASH as a private eye. Don Medford directed a bunch of those, the first few. That show actually also had Douglas Hayes from Twilight Zone working on it. He did a TV movie in 1980 called Coach of the Year that starred Robert Conrad as a paraplegic coach. And he also did another one in 1981 called Sizzle that had Lonnie Anderson from WKRP in Cincinnati, and Roy Thinnis from The Invaders and from that Dark Shadows revival. For Tales of Tomorrow, Don Medford directed several really standout episodes. We around here we really like The Fury of the Cocoon, which is a memorable entry about African jungle explorers that face off against giant blood-sucking insects from outer space that happen to be invisible. Got another actor here that we should probably tell you about as well. I don't want to leave these folks out. This fellow here, he's playing, I think it's a professor, basically. He's a doctor, Dr. Meshkov, this fellow right here on the right. And he's played by an actor named Michael Gorbin, but that's not actually his real name. He originally did his first few films under his real name, which was a little bit more ethnic. His real name was Michael Goldstein, and he had a couple of bit roles in movies under that name in the 30s. He was a Polish actor who played a lot of ethnic roles that required him to have a variety of non-American sounding accents. This is his only Tales of Tomorrow, and it's one of his first roles as Michael Gorin under that name. He went on to do the usual TV anthologies like Robert Montgomery Presents, Philco Television Playhouse, Armstrong Circle Theater, Goodyear Playhouse, and the United States Steel Hour. He also did shows like Mr. Peepers, Car 54, Where Are You?, Naked City, and a couple episodes of I Spy. He's in a 1961 movie called Dead to the World. He also had bit roles in the original 1974 Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, and the 1979 Al Pacino film Injustice for All. Michael Gorin seems to have made his last acting appearance in the 1981 pilot episode for the Cagney and Lacey TV series. So here we have Paul Newman finally. You'll note that he's really trying to get his attention to put on him for this little tiny role. He's chewing gum, takes off his military cap fairly quickly, and I wouldn't say he actually looks directly into the camera, but he does kind of ham it up a little bit. You can tell he's really just trying to stand out with what little he has. He wants people to notice him and realize that he was actually in this episode. And of course, few realize how famous he'd become. And he rarely did science fiction. I think you only ever saw him in, I think maybe one other science fiction film besides this. And he had done very little before this. I mean, this is basically his first role, his first TV role, and his first actual role. His first professional acting gig, anyways. He's playing here Sergeant Wilson, I believe it is. And he definitely makes the most of his time on camera. Quintet, I think, was the other sci-fi film he did. That was in the late 70s, a Robert Altman film. And in 1952, he wasn't doing a whole lot of acting yet. He only had a couple of other credits. He was a semi-regular on a show back then called The Aldrich Family. And he did a couple of the creepy anthologies that were on at the time. He did a couple episodes. He did one episode of Suspense, I think, and he did the first of several episodes he'd do for a show called The Web in 1952. Did a couple more the following year. We talk about both those shows a lot in these DVD commentaries. They have a lot in common with Tales of Tomorrow, including a lot of the creators and performers. And the kid's really not too bad, this Paul Newman guy. He seems to kind of have a good future, doesn't he? Well, now that we've saved the world yet again, turns out that it doesn't make a lot of sense because the ice has already landed on Earth and it's already spreading, but our Air Force commander decided he was going to sacrifice himself and save the world by flying the ice cube back into space. And that kind of sacrifices a bit of logic. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense because why flying the ice cube back into space after the ice itself was already spread across 50 miles is kind of unclear. So But the reason we get to see this, though, still is because the original broadcasts, they were probably much sharper, but they're being broadcast over the air on primitive TV sets, the first wave of commercially available TV sets. And the reason we can still actually watch them now is because what they did was they created kinescopes of these programs as they were being performed in broadcast. And the kinescope process involves basically just pointing a film camera at the TV as the show's being broadcast, being performed, and then you film it. And it's by virtue of that we get to see these. Unfortunately, not all of them survive, but most of we've got to think about a third of them that we can watch. That we on these DVD sets here, we get to see them all cleaned up digitally as best as possible. We have restored sound. But yeah, it is only because of those kinescopes, which themselves were only created in order to be able to do repeats. This was really the age when videotape was just starting to come into being. And they wanted to be able to repeat this show on the West Coast. So in order to do that, they would create these kinescopes, and 2 or 3 weeks later, that would be when this episode aired in California. I think the next episode that aired after this one that the announcer wants to tell us about is A Child is Crying. That's actually a repeat, which is also rare back then because, again, they weren't on videotape. You didn't really see shows repeated, but A Child is Crying is one of the most popular episodes of the show. It got a lot of mail. We talk about it at length in that commentary. And so in an unusual situation, they actually repeated that the following week, and it gave them a little time to create the next week's episode. So that brings us through yet another episode of Tales of Tomorrow. I hope you liked hearing about it as much as I enjoyed talking about it. I feel like we had a very good cast in this one, and we did a whole lot of really good work with just a couple sets and costumes. And thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it.